To talk Python to me.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again.
Yes, you're my favorite guest. It's always awesome to have you
Oh,
on the
thanks. You're
show.
my favorite
So
podcast.
thank you. And we have some really cool things to talk about. Spacey, some, of course, but also more broadly, we're going to talk about just LLMs and AIs and open source and business models and even monopolies. We're going to
Yeah.
cover a lot of things. You've been kind of making a bit of a road show, a tour around much of Europe, talking about some of these ideas, right?
Yeah, I've gotten invited to quite a few conferences, and I feel like this is like after COVID, the first like proper year again that I'm like traveling for conferences, and I was like, why not?
Mhm.
And I think especially now that so much is happening in the AI space, I think it's actually really nice to go to these conferences and connect with actual developers because if you're just sitting on the internet and you're scrolling, I don't know, LinkedIn, and sometimes it can be really hard to tell like what people are really thinking and what's,
Yeah.
if like, do people really believe some of these hot, weird takes that people are putting out there? And so, yeah, it was very, very nice to talk about some of these ideas, get them checked against what developers think. So, yeah, that's been really cool.
Yeah,
And
that's
there's more to
excellent.
come.
Yeah, I know. That's
I'll be
awesome.
traveling again later this month to Italy for PyCon for my first time, then PyData London,
Mhm.
and who knows what else.
Oh, so if you must go to Italy and London, what terrible places to spend time in, huh?
Well, I'm definitely very open for tips, especially for Italy, for Florence. I've never been to Italy ever. So
Oh, awesome. I've been to Rome, but that's it, and, so I don't have any tips, but, London is also fantastic.
yeah,
Cool, so people can check you out, maybe, I think do you have a list of that publicly where people can
yes,
see some of your
it's
talks? We
it's
can put that in the show notes, yeah.
yeah, it's on my website, and then also on the Explosion side, like of our company, we've actually added an events page because it came up a lot that like either me, Matt, people from our team giving talks, and so we thought like, hey, let's and podcast as well. So we're collecting everything on one page, all the stuff we're doing, which is
Uh-huh.
kind of fun.
Which is quite a bit actually, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know many people know you, but let's just talk a little bit about Spacey, Explosion, Prodigy, the stuff that you guys are doing to give people a sense of where you're coming from.
Yeah, so we're an open source company, and we build developer tools for AI, natural language processing specifically. So, you're working with lots of text, you want to analyze it beyond just looking for keywords. That's kind of where we started and what we've always been focusing on. So, Spacey is probably what we're mostly known for, which is a popular open source library for really what we call industrial strength NLP. So built for production, it's fast, it's efficient. We've put a lot of work into, having good, usable, user-friendly, developer-friendly APIs. Actually, yeah, that's an example I always like to show in my talks. A nice side effect that we never anticipated like that is that ChatGPT and similar models are actually pretty good at writing Spacey code because we put a lot of work into all of this stuff like backwards compatibility, not breaking people's code all the time, stuff like that. But that happens to really help, at least for now, with these models,
Yeah,
because
it's really nice. It's a good thing you've done to make it a really stable API that people can trust. But is it weird to see LLMs talking about stuff you all created? Kind
I
of
mean,
like,
it's kind of it's funny in some way. I mean, it's also there is this whole other side to doing user support for detecting clearly auto-generated code because for Spacey these models are pretty good. For Prodigy, which is our annotation tool, which is also scriptable in Python, it's a bit less precise and it hallucinates a lot because there's just less code online and on GitHub. And so we sometimes get like support requests where like users post their code and we're like, this is so strange. How did you find these APIs? They don't exist. And then we're like, this was auto-generated. Oh, okay. So that
mhm.
was a very new experience. And also it's I think everyone who publishes online deals with that, but like it's very frustrating to see all these like auto-generated posts that like look like tech posts but are completely bullshit and completely wrong. Like I saw with something on Spacey LLM, which is our extension for integrating large language models into Spacey, and they're like some blog posts that look like they're tech blog posts, but they're like completely hallucinated. And it's very, very strange to see that about like your own software. And also it frustrates me because that stuff is going to feed into the next generation of these models, right? And then they will stop being potentially so good at this because they're full of stuff that they've generated themselves on like APIs and things that don't even exist.
Cycle around and around and around until it just gets worse every time, and then
so that's interesting. Like it's very interesting to see what's going on and where these things lead.
It is. I just had a thought. I was OpenAI and some of these different companies are doing work to try to detect AI generated images, and I imagine AI generated content. And when I heard that, my thought was like, well, that's just because they kind of want to be good citizens and they want to put little labels and say this is. What if it's just so they don't ingest it twice?
I think that's definitely, and I mean, in a way, it's also good because it would make these models worse. And so from from a product perspective, for a company like OpenAI, that's definitely very useful. And I think also, commercially, I think there's definitely, a big market in that also for like social networks and stuff to, to detect, are these real images, are these deep fakes? Definitely money in that too. So it's not, I don't think it's just, being good citizens, but like there's a clear product motivated thing, which is fine, for a company.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it is fine. I never really thought about it. Of course.
Yeah.
Do you think we'll get to some point where, in like food or art, you hear about, artisanal handcrafted pizza or, whatever? Will there be artisanal human created tech that has got a special flavor to it? Like this was created with no AI. Look at how cool this site is.
Yeah, I think it's already something that like you see, like, I don't know which product this was, but there was some ad campaign. I think it might've been a language learning app or something else where they really like put that into one of their like marketing claims, like, hey, it's not AI generated. We don't use AI. It's actually real and humans, because it seems to be, what people want. They want, they want to have at least that feeling. So I definitely think there's an appeal of that also going forward.
The whole LLM and AI stuff, it's permeated culture so much. I was at the motorcycle shop yesterday talking to a guy who was a motorcycle salesman, and he was like, do you think that AI is going to change how software developers work? Do you think they're still going to be relevant? I'm like, you're a motorcycle sales guy. It's amazing.
Wow.
That you're like really this tuned into it, right? And that you're like, but you think it's maybe just a little echo chamber of us talking about, but it seems to be like these kinds of conversations are more broad than maybe you would have guessed.
And I think ChatGPT definitely, brought the conversation into the mainstream. But on the other hand, on the plus side, it also means it makes it a lot easier for us kind of to explain our work, because people have at least heard of this. And I think it's also for developers working in teams, like, on the one hand, it can maybe be frustrating to do this expectation management, because, you have management who just came back from some fancy conference and got sold on like, oh, we need like some chatbot or LLM. It's kind of the chatbot hype all over again that we already had in 2015 or so. That can be frustrating.
I forgot all about that. Those were going to be so important. And now what are they doing? Nothing.
But it's like I see a lot of parallels. It's like, if you look at kind of the hype cycle and people's expectations and expectation management, it's kind of the same thing in a lot of ways, only that like it actually a lot of parts actually kind of work now, which we didn't really have before. But it also means for teams and developers that they at least have some more funding available and resources that they can work with, because I feel like before that happened, it looked like that, companies are really cutting their budgets. All these exploratory AI projects, they all got cut. It was quite frustrating for a lot of developers. And now, at least, it means they can actually work again, even though they also have to kind of manage the expectations and like work around some of the very wild ideas that companies
Yeah.
might have at the moment.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that's really important, and we're going to get to here, give you a chance to give a shout out to the other thing that you all have is how do you teach these things information, and how do you get them to know things, and so on. And for the Spacey world, you have Prodigy, and maybe give a shout out to Prodigy Teams. That's something you just are just announcing, right?
Yeah, so that's currently in beta. It's something we've been working on. So the idea of Prodigy has always been, it supports Spacey, also other libraries, and how can we make the training and data collection process more efficient, or so efficient that companies can in-house that process, like whether it's creating training data, creating evaluation data, like even if what you're doing is completely generative and you have a model that does it well, you need some examples and some data where you know the answer. And often that's a structured data format. So you need to create that. And we've, really seen that like outsourcing that doesn't work very well. And also now with the newer technologies, with transfer learning, you don't need millions of examples anymore. This whole this big data idea for task specific stuff is really dead in a lot of ways. So Prodigy is a developer tool that you can script in Python, and that makes it easy to really collect this kind of structured data on text, images, and so on. And then Prodigy Teams, that has been a very ambitious project. We've we've wanted to ship this a long time ago already, but it's been very challenging because we basically want to bring also a lot of these ideas that probably we're going to talk about today a bit into the cloud, while retaining the data privacy. And so you'll be able to run your own cluster on your own infrastructure that has the data that's scriptable in Python. So you can kind of script the SaaS app in Python, which is very cool, which you normally can't do. Your data never leaves our service. And you can basically also use these workflows like distillation, where you start out with a super easy prototype that might use Llama or some other models, ChatGPT, GPT-4. Then you benchmark that, see how it does, and then you collect some data until you can beat that in accuracy and have a task-specific model that really only does the one extraction you're interested in. And that model can be tiny. Like we've had users build models that are under 10 megabytes. Like that is pretty crazy to think about these days. And that run like 20 times faster. They're entirely private. You can, you don't need like tons of compute to run them. And that's kind of really one of the workflows of the future that we see as very promising. And it's also, people are often surprised how little task-specific data you actually need to, say, beat GPT-4 in accuracy. It's not as much as people think. And it's totally, in a single workday, you could often do it. And so the main idea we've been thinking about a lot is basically how can we make that workflow better and more user-friendly, even for people who don't have an extensive machine learning background. Right. Because one thing that like prompting an LLM or prompting a generative model has is that it's a very low barrier to entry, and it's very the UX is very good. You just type in a question, you talk to it the way you would talk to a human, and that's that's easy to get started with. And the workflow that's a bit more involved, yes, machine learning developers know how to do that, and they know when to do it, but it's not as accessible to people who don't have all of that experience. And so that's kind of the underlying thing that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, you talked about transfer learning and using relatively small amounts of data to specialize models. Tell people about what that is. I'm like, how do you actually do that?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, it's actually the same idea that has ultimately really led to these large generative models that we see. And that's essentially realizing that we can learn a lot about the language and the world, and a lot of general stuff from raw text. Like if we just train a model with a language modeling objective on like a bunch of text on the whole internet or parts of the internet or whatever, in order to basically solve the task, which can be stuff like predict the next word. In order to do that, the model has to learn so much in its weights and in its representations about the language and about like really underlying subtle stuff about the language, that it's also really good at other stuff. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the basic idea, and that's then later led to larger and larger models and more and more of these ideas. But the basic concept is, if you just train on a lot of raw text, and a lot of these models are available, like something like BERT, that's already like quite a few years old, but still, if you look at kind of the literature and look at the experiments people are doing, it's still very competitive. It's like you get really good results even with one of the most basic foundation models, and you can use that, initialize your model with that, and then just train like a small task network on top instead of training everything from scratch, which is what you had to do before. Or it's like, if you imagine hiring a new employee, it's like, yes, you expect, you can raise them from birth, or you can sort of have them, which is like, again, very creepy concept, but it's really quite similar. And yeah, teach them everything.
You were born to be a barista, let me tell you.
Yeah,
literally.
and then you teach them English, and you teach them. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work, and I guess you know this more than me because you have kids, right? So, yeah. So, and it's understandable that, like, okay, this made a lot of these ML projects really hard, but now.
Yeah.
You actually have the employee come in, and they know how to talk to people. They speak the language, and all you have to teach them is like, hey, here's how you make a coffee here. And
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You basically lean on the school system to say,
Yeah.
they know the language, they know arithmetic. They
Yeah,
know
exactly.
how to talk to people. I just need to show them how this espresso machine works. Here's how you check in. Please take out the trash every 2 hours. Like,
Yeah.
a very little bit of specialized information, but
Exactly.
the sort of general working human knowledge is like the base LLM, right?
Yeah. So that's the idea. And also transfer learning, it's just one technology. And in context learning, which is what we have with these generative models, that's also just another technique. Like it's not the case that transfer learning is sort of outdated or has been replaced by in context learning. It's two different strategies, and you use them in different contexts. So yeah.
Cool. Another thing I want to touch on for people, I know some people, probably everyone listening is more or less aware of this, but in practice, a lot of folks out there listening, certainly the ones who are not in the ML or developer space, they just go to chat or they go to somewhere and they're like, this is the AI I've gone to, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they go to Bard, I don't know, Gemini now, whatever they call it. But there's a whole bunch, I mean, many, many, many open source models with all sorts of variations. One thing I really like is LM Studio. Ian Moyer introduced me to it a couple of months ago. And basically it's a UI for exploring Hugging Face models and then downloading them and running them with like a chat interface just in a UI. And the really cool thing is they just added Llama 3, but a lot of these are open source. A lot of these are accessible. You run them on your machine. You get 7 billion parameter models to run easily on my Mac Mini. Yeah. What do you think about some of these models?
Yeah, no, it's
the huge ones.
Yeah, no, I think it's, and also a lot of them are like, the model itself is not necessarily much smaller than what a lot of these chat assistants deploy. And I think it's also, these are really just the core models for everything that's like proprietary and sort of in-house behind like an API. There's at least one open source version that's very similar. Like I think it's you can the raw model is really based on academic research, a lot of the same data that's available, and I think the most important differentiation we see is then around these chat assistants and how they work and how the products are designed. So I think it's also it's kind of a nice exercise or a nice way to look at this distinction between the products versus the machine-facing models, because I think that's AI, or like these products are more than just a model, and I think that's like a super important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. It's
And I
actually
think,
super,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
It's really relevant for this conversation because you have a
yeah,
whole section where you talk about regulation and what is the thing, what is the aspect of these things that should or could be regulated. We'll get to that in a minute.
yeah.
But
But I
to
think
give
actually a lot
people,
of, yeah, so
oh,
sorry, a lot
sorry.
of the confusion that people have around like, oh, are we like, is all AI going to be locked away behind APIs, and how do these bigger models work? I think it kind of stems from the fact that like, it's not always the distinction between like the models and products isn't always clear. And you could even argue maybe some companies that are in this business, it benefits them to call everything the AI,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that really doesn't help. So here you really
Yeah.
see the models.
Yeah, and it just sorry to talk over you, but to give people a sense, even if you search for Llama 3 in this thing, there's 192 different configured, modified, etc. ways to work with the Llama 3 model, which is just crazy. So there's a lot of stuff that maybe people haven't really explored, I imagine.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, yeah. One other thing about this, just while we're on it, is it also comes with a open AI API, so you could just run it and say, turn on a server API endpoint if I want to talk to it. Very fun. But let's talk about some of the things you talked about in your talk. The AI revolution will not be monopolized. How open source beats economies of scale, even for LLMs. I love it. It's a great title and a great topic.
No, thanks. No, it's something I'm very passionate about. I was like, I was very, happy to be able to say a lot of these things, or to, also be given a platform
Yeah.
to say things.
Yeah, you and we've spoken before about open source and running successful businesses in the tech space and all sorts of things. So it's a cool follow on for sure.
Yep.
I think one of the first parts that you talked about that was really interesting and has nothing to do specifically with LLMs or AI is just why is open source a good choice, and why are people choosing? Why is it a good thing to base businesses on and so on?
Yeah, yeah. I also often, when I give this as a talk, I ask like for a show of hands, like, hey, who uses open source software, or who works for a
Mhm.
company that depends on open source software, who's contributed before? And usually, I think, yeah, most people raise their hand when I ask like who works for a company that relies on open source software. So I often feel like, hey, I don't even have to like explain like, hey, it's a thing. It's more about like, collecting these reasons. And I do think
Yeah. Yeah.
a lot of it is around like, the transparency, the extensibility. It's all kind of connected. Like you're not locked in. You can run it in-house. You can fork it. You can, program with it. Like those are all important things for companies when they adopt software. And you have these small teams running the project. They can accept PRs. They can move fast. There's a community around it that can basically give you a sense for, hey, is this a thing? Should I adopt it? And all of this, I think, is important. And I also often make a point to like, yes, I always mention, hey, it's also free, which is what people usually associate with open source software.
Right.
It's kind of the first thing
Yeah.
that comes to mind. But
Yeah.
I actually don't think this is for companies the main motivation why they use open source software.
I absolutely agree. I mean, even though we have FOSS,
Yeah.
free and open source software, this is not really why companies care about it, right?
Yeah.
Certainly some people do, some people don't, but
Yeah.
companies, they often see that as a negative, I think, almost like, well, who do we sue if this goes wrong? Where's our our
Yeah. Like,
service level
well, who can we?
agreement? Who's going to help us? Who's
Yeah. Yeah.
legally
I mean,
obligated to help us?
we've definitely also seen that, or like we have, companies who are like, well, who can we pay, or can we pay
Yeah.
to like,
Yeah.
I don't know, get, some guarantee or like some support, or can you like confirm to us that, hey, if there is a critical vulnerability that's like really directly affecting our software, which has never happened, but are you going to fix it? And
Yeah.
we're like, yes, we can say that. That's what we've been doing. But if you want that guarantee, we can give that to you for money, sure.
Yes.
But like,
You can pay
but
us. We'll promise to do what we already promised to do, but we'll really double promise to do,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So it's like that's
Yeah.
definitely a thing. And also it's kind of to go back up to the business model thing. It's what we've seen with Prodigy, which we offer kind of, really, as a tool, it follows the open source spirit. Like you pip install it. It's a Python library. You work with it. But we decided to kind of use that as a stepping stone between our free open source offering and like the SaaS product that we're about to launch soon, hopefully. And it's kind of in the middle, and it's paid. And we've definitely, not found that this is like a huge disadvantage for companies. Like, yes, sure, you always have companies with like no budget, but those are also usually not the teams that are really doing, a lot of the high value work, because, it is quite normal to have a budget, or like of software tools. Companies pay a lot for this. Like, if you want to buy Prodigy, like that costs less than, I don't know, getting a decent office chair. Like, in a commercial context, these scales are all a bit different. So, yeah, I do think companies are happy to pay for something that they need, and that's good.
Yeah, and the ones who wouldn't have paid, maybe there's a group who said, well, maybe I'll use the free one, but they're not serious enough about it to actually pay for it or actually make use of it. I think of sort of analogies to piracy, right? Like, they stole our app or they stole our music. Like, well, because it was a link, they clicked it, but they wouldn't have bought it or used it at all. It's not like you lost a customer, because they were not going to be customers. They just happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, I always tell the story of like when I was, a teenager, I did download a cracked version of Adobe Photoshop, and because I was a teenager, I would have never been able, like back then they didn't have a SaaS model. Like, I don't know what Photoshop costs, but like it's definitely not something I would have been able to afford as a 13, 14-year-old. So I did find that online. I downloaded it. I'm pretty sure if Adobe had wanted, they could have come after me for that. And I do think, like, I don't know, maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but I do think they might have not done that because they're like, well, it's not like we lost a customer here. And now I'm an adult and I'm proficient at Photoshop, and now I'm paying for it. And
yeah, exactly.
And I think there was this whole generation of teenagers who then maybe went into creative jobs and came in with Photoshop skills. Like, I wasn't even like, compared to all these other teenagers I was hanging out with on the internet, like all these, like mostly girls, I wasn't even that talented at Photoshop specifically. So, maybe there was someone smart who thought about this as like a business strategy, that these teenagers have our professional tools.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost marketing. Okay, so another aspect here that I think is really relevant to LLMs is runs in-house, aka we're not sending our private data, private source code, API keys, etc., to other companies that may even use that to train their models, which then regurgitate that back to other people trying to solve the same problems, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's also, we're definitely seeing that companies are becoming more and more aware of this, which is good. Like in a lot of industries, like I wouldn't want, I don't know, my healthcare provider to just upload all of my data to like whichever SaaS tool they decide to use at the moment. Like, of course not. So I think it's, it's good. And then also with, more data privacy regulations, that's really on people's minds, and people don't want this. Like often we have companies or users who actually have to run a lot of their AI stuff on completely air-gapped machines, so they can't even have internet access, or it's about financial stuff. We're actually working on a case study that we're hoping to publish soon, where even the financial information can move markets. It's even segregated in the office, so it needs to be 100% in-house.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. And I think open source software is great because you can do that, and you can build your own things with it and really decide how you want to host it, how it fits into your existing stack. That's another big thing. People will already use some tools, and you don't want to change your entire workflow for every different tool or platform you use. And I think especially people have been burned by that so many times by now, and there's so many unreliable startups, things. There's a company that really tries to convince you to build on their product, and then 2 months later they close everything down, or it doesn't even have to be startup. Google, I'm still mad at Google for shutting down Google Reader, and I don't know, it's been over 10 years, I'm sure, and I'm still angry about that. I actually we were invited to give a talk at Google and I needed a text example to visualize, something grammatical, and that text I made, Google shut down Google Reader as a quiet protest.
That's amazing.
But yeah, anyway,
We're going to
I'm
run
not
sentiment analysis on this article
yeah.
here.
But yeah, anyways, I mean, sure, open source projects can become unmaintained, and that sucks. But like, you can fork it. It's there, and you can have it. So there is this. This is motivating, and I think we've always called it like you can reinvent the wheel, but don't reinvent the road, which is basically you can build something. Reinventing the wheel, I don't think is bad, but like you don't want to make people follow like your way of doing everything. And
that's interesting. Yeah, like we have electric cars now. All right. So give us a sense of some of the open source models like in this AI space here.
Yeah, so I've kind of divided it into sort of 3 categories. So one of them is what I've called task-specific models. So that's really models that were trained to do one specific or some specific things. It's kind of what we distribute for Spacey. There's also a lot of really cool community projects like SciSpacey for scientific biomedical text. Stanford also publishes their Stanza models. And yeah, if you've been on the Hugging Face Hub, there's like tons of these models that were really fine-tuned to predict like a particular type of categories, stuff like that. And so that's been around for quite a while, quite established. A lot of people use these in production. And they're also quite, especially nowadays, but today's standards, quite small, cheap. But of course, they do one particular thing. So they don't generalize very well. So that's kind of the one category.
Yeah. Well, you probably used to think of them as large, and now you see how giant.
No, I remember
how
when
many gigabytes those models are.
Yeah, when deep learning first kind of came about, and people were sort of migrating from linear models and stuff. Like I remember people complaining that the models were so big and slow. And that was before we even, used much transfer learning and transformer models and BERT and stuff. And even when that came about, it was also first a challenge. Like, hey, these are significantly bigger. We do have to change a lot around it. Or even, Google, who published BERT, they, had to do a lot of work around it to, make it work into their workflows and ship them into production and optimize them, because they're quite different from what was there before. So
another one in this category of task-specific models is SciSpacey, which is kind of cool. What's SciSpacey?
Yeah. So SciSpacey, that's for scientific biomedical text that was published by Allen AI researchers, and it's really it has like components specific for working with that sort of data. And it's actually, it's definitely, if that's kind of the domain, any listeners are working with, definitely check it out. They've also done some pretty smart work around like training components, but also implementing like hybrid rule-based things for, say, acronym expansion. They're like cool algorithms that you can implement that don't necessarily need much machine learning, but that work really well. And so it's basically this suite of components and also models that are more tuned for that domain.
Nice. And then you mentioned some of them, but also encoder models. What's the difference between the task-specific ones and the encoder ones?
So that's kind of also what we were talking about earlier, actually, with the transfer learning foundation models. So these are models trained with a language modeling objective, for example, like Google's BERT, and they can also be the foundation for task-specific models. That's kind of what we're often doing nowadays. Like you start out with some of these pre-trained weights, and then you train like this task-specific network on top of it that uses everything that is in these weights about the language and the world. Actually, by today's standards, these are still relatively small and relatively fast. And they generalize better because they're trained on a lot of raw text that has like a lot of that intrinsic meta knowledge about the language and the world that we need to solve a lot of other tasks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then you've used the term large generative models for things like Llama and Mistral and so on.
Yeah. I think, one thing that's very unfortunate when talking about these models is that like everything we've talked about here has at some point been called an LLM by someone. And that makes it like really hard to talk about it. And so like, but now you can argue that like, well, all of them are kind of large language models, right? And then there's also the marketing confusion, like when LLMs were hot, everyone wants to have LLMs, and so by some definition of LLMs, we've all been running LLMs in production for years. But basically, I've kind of decided, okay, I want to try and avoid that phrase as much as possible because it really doesn't help. And so large generative models kind of captures that same idea, but it makes it clear, okay, these generate text goes in, text comes out, and they're large, and they're different from the other types of models, basically.
Yeah. So a question on the audience is, Mr. Magnetic said, I'd love to learn how to develop AI. So maybe let me rephrase that just a little bit and see what your thoughts are. Like, if people want to get more foundational, this kind of stuff, like what areas should they maybe focus in to learn?
It depends on really, what it means. Like, what it, if you really, there is a whole path to, okay, you really want to learn more about the models, how they work, the research that goes into it. I think there's a lot of actually also academic resources and courses that you can take that are similar to what you would learn in university if you started
like an ML course.
Like ML. And also I think some universities have made some of their like beginners courses public, and I think
Stanford has.
Right. I thought Stanford. I think there's someone else, but like there's definitely also a lot of stuff coming out. So you can kind of go in that direction, really learn okay, what goes into this, what's the theory behind these. And there are some people who really like that approach. And then there's a whole more practical side. Okay, I want to build an application that uses the technology, and that and it solves the problem. And often it helps to have like an idea of what you want to do. Like if you don't want to develop AI for the sake of it, then it often helps, like, hey, you have, even if it's just your hobby, like you're into football and you come up with like some fun problem, like you want to analyze football news, for example, and analyze it for something you care about. Like I don't know, like often really helps to have this hobby angle or something you're interested in, and then you can start looking at tools that go in that direction. Like start with some of these open source models, even try out some of these generative models. See how you go. Try out, if you want to do information extraction, try out maybe something like Spacey. There's like really a lot there, and it's definitely become a lot easier to get started and build something these days. Yeah.
Some more good questions out there. I'm going to save those for the end. All right. So another thing you talked about was economies of scale. And this one's really interesting. So basically we've got Gemini and OpenAI, where they've just got so much traffic. And, if kind of a little bit back to the question actually is, if you want to do this kind of stuff, you want to run your own service doing it, or build, even if you had the equivalent stuff, it's tricky because even just the way you batch compute, you maybe want to talk about that a bit.
So, but the idea of economies of scale is basically, well, as the companies produce more output, the cost per unit decreases, and there's like all kinds of basically gets cheaper to do more stuff, and they're like a lot of more boring, like businessy reasons why it's like that. But I think for machine learning specifically, the fact that GPUs are so parallel really makes a difference here. And because you get the user text in, you can't just arbitrarily chop up that text because the context matters. You need to process that. So in order to make the most use of the compute, you basically need to batch it up. So either kind of need to wait until there's enough to batch up, and that means that yes, that favors a lot of those providers that have a lot of traffic, or you introduce latency. So that's definitely that's definitely something that at least looks like a problem, or something that can be discouraging, because it feels like, hey, if supposedly the only way you can kind of participate is by running these models, then either you have to run them yourself or go via an API, like then you're kind of doomed. And does that mean that okay, only some large companies can provide AI for us? So that's kind of also the point, and the very legit worry that some people have, like, does that lead to monopolizing AI basically?
Yeah, it's a very valid concern, because even if you say, okay, look, here's the deal. OpenAI gets to run on Azure. I can go get a machine with a GPU stuck to it and run that on Azure. Well, guess what? They get one of those huge ARM chips that's like the size of a plate. And they get the special machines, and they also get either wholesale compute costs, or they get just, we'll give you a bunch of compute for some ownership of your company, kind of like Microsoft and OpenAI.
Yeah.
How do you that's a very difficult thing to compete with on one hand, right?
Yeah. I mean, that is like, yes, if you want to, run, your own LLM or generative model API services, that's definitely, a disadvantage you're going to have. But on the other hand, I think one thing that leads to this perception that I think is not necessarily true is the fact that if you want to do anything, you need basically larger and larger models that if you want to do something specific, the only way to get there is to turn that request into arbitrary language, and then use the largest model that can handle arbitrary language, and then go from there. Like and I know this is like something that maybe a lot of LLM companies want to tell you, but that's not necessarily true. And you don't, for a lot of things you're doing, you don't even need to depend on a large model at runtime. You can distill it and you can use it at development time, and then build something that you can run in-house. And these calculations also look very, very different if you're using something at development time versus in production at runtime. And then it can actually be totally fine to just run something in-house. And the other point here is actually if we're having a situation where, hey, you're paying a large company to provide some service for you, provide a model for you via an API, and there are lots of companies, and kind of the main differentiator is who can offer it for cheaper. That's sort of the opposite of a monopoly, at least, right? That's like competition. Yeah. So this actually, I feel like economies of scale, this idea does not prove that, hey, we're heading into we're heading into an AI monopoly, and it's also not true, because it's not if you realize that, hey, it's not, you don't need the biggest most arbitrary models for everything you're doing, then the calculation looks very, very different.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a couple of thoughts I also have here. Is one, this LM Studio I was talking about, I've been running the Llama 3 7 billion parameter model locally instead of using chat these days, and it's been, I would say, just as good. And it runs about the same speed on my Mac Mini as a typical request does over there. I mean, I can't handle as many, but it's just me. It's my computer, right? I'm fine. And then the other one is, if you specialize one of these models, right, you feed it a bunch of your data sets from your companies, right, it might not be able to write you write you something in the style of Shakespeare
Yeah.
around, a legal contract or some weird thing like that. But it can probably answer really good questions about, what is our company policy on this, or what do our engineering reports about this thing say, or stuff that you actually
Yeah.
care about, right?
Yeah,
You
no,
can run
exactly.
that.
And also often, that's kind of what you want. Like you actually want to, if you're talking about, if we're going to like some of the risks or things people are worried about, like a lot of that is around what people refer to like, the model going rogue, or like the model doing stuff it's not supposed to do.
Yeah.
And, if you're just sort of wrapping ChatGPT and you're not careful, then, and you're giving it access to stuff, there's a lot of unintended things that people could do with it if you're actually running this. And once you expose it to users, there's like a lot of risks there. And
Yeah.
writing something in the style of Shakespeare is like probably the most harmless outcome that you can get. But like that is kind of a risk, and you basically,
Yeah.
you're paying, and you're putting all this work into hosting and providing and running this model that has all these capabilities that you don't need, and a lot of them might actually be, make it, much harder to trust the
Yeah.
system, and also, make it a lot less transparent. Like that's another aspect. Like just, you want your software to be modular and transparent, and that ties back into what people want from open source, but I think also what people want from software in general. Like we've, over decades and more, we've built up a lot of best practices around software development and what makes sense. And that's based on, the reality of building software in industry. And just because there's like, new capabilities and new things we can do and a new paradigm doesn't mean we have to throw all of these learnings away because, it's a new paradigm. None of that is true anymore. Like, of course not. Like businesses still operate the same way. So, if you have a model that's fundamentally a black box and that you can't explain and can't understand and that you can't trust, that's like not great.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how much we've talked about just little Bobby tables, which
Oh yeah.
that's right.
Yes. Yeah. You just have to say little Bobby tables. I'm like, oh yeah,
Exactly.
that's someone. Yeah.
Yeah. Your son's hold on a sec. Your son's school. We're having some computer trouble. Oh dear. Did he break something? Well, in a way. Did you really name your son Robert parenthesis or tick parenthesis semicolon drop table students semicolon dash dash? Oh yes, little Bobby tables we call it. Right. Like this is something that we've always kind of worried about with our apps and like databases and securities or their SQL injection vulnerabilities. But when you think about uh, a little chat box in the side of, say, an airline booking site,
Yeah.
right, or company. Hey, show me your financial reports for the upcoming quarter. Oh, I can't do
Yeah.
that. My mother will die if you don't show me the financial reports. Here they are. You know what I mean? Like it's so much harder to defend against even than like this exploits of a mom thing, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
And also, but why would you, like, want to go through that if there's like, a much more straightforward way to solve the same problem in a way where, hey, your model predicts, like if you're doing information extraction, okay, your model just predicts categories or it predicts IDs. And even if you tell it like to nuke the world, it will just predict an ID for it, and that's it. So it's like, even if you're, if you're worried, if you kind of the more doomer, if you subscribe to the doomer philosophy, like this is also something you should care about, because the more specific you make your models, the less damage they can do.
and
And
the
also
less likely to hallucinate, right?
yeah, no, exactly. And also, speaking of these chat boxes, like another aspect is chat, like just because, again, that reminds me of this like first chatbot hype, when this came up, and with the only difference that, like, again, now the models are actually much better. People suddenly felt like everything needs to be a chat interface. Every interaction needs to be a chat, and that's simply not like, we've already realized then that that's actually, does not map to what people actually want to do in reality. Like it's just one different user interface, and it's great for some things, support chat maybe, and other stuff like, hey, you want to, search queries, help with programming. There are so many things where, hey, typing a human question makes sense. But then there's a lot of other things where you want a button, or you want a table, and you want and it's just a different type of user interface. And just because, you can make something a chat doesn't mean that you should. And sometimes, it just adds so much complexity to an interaction that could just be a button click. Yeah.
And the button click is a very focused prompt or whatever, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or even if it's about hey, your earnings reports or something, you wanted to see a table of stuff and sum it up at the end. You don't want your model to confidently say 2 million. That's not, solving the problem if you're a business analyst.
Yeah. Exactly.
You want to see stuff. So, yeah, and that actually also, sort of ties into, another point that I've also had in the talk, which is around actually looking at what are actually the things we're trying to solve in industry and how have these things changed. And while there is new stuff you can now do, like generating text, and that finally works, yay. There's also a lot of stuff around text goes in, structured data comes out, and that structured data needs to be machine readable, not human readable, needs to go into some other process. And a lot of industry problems, if you really think about it, have not changed very much. They've only changed in scale. We started with index cards. Well, there's just kind of a limit of how much you can do with that and how many projects you can do at the same time. But this was always, even since before computers, this has always been bringing structure into unstructured data has always been the fundamental challenge. And that's not going to just magically go away because we have new capacities and new things we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Hold on, I'm searching ahead a little bit. All right, so let's talk about some of the workflows here. So you have an example where you take a large model and do some prompting, and this sort of iterative model assisted data annotation. What's that look like?
So as you said, you start out with this model, maybe one of these models that you can run locally, an API during development time, and you prompt it to produce some structured output, for example, or some answer. We also have for example, you can use something like Spacey LLM that lets you plug in any model in the same way you would otherwise train a model yourself, and then you look at the results. You can actually get a good feel for how is your model even doing. And you can also, before you really get into distilling a model, you can create some data to evaluate it, because I think that's something people are often forgetting, because it's kind of maybe not the funnest part, but it's really, it's like writing tests. It's like writing tests can be frustrating. I remember when I kind of started out, tests are frustrating because they actually they turn up all of these edge cases and mistakes that you kind of want to forget about. So
I forgot to test for this. Whoops.
Yeah. And then if you start writing tests and you suddenly see all the stuff that goes wrong, and then you have to fix it, and it's annoying. So you better just not have tests. I can see that, but evaluation is kind of like that, and it's ultimately a lot of these problems. You have to know what you want, and here's the input, here's the expected output. You kind of have to define that, and that's not something any AI can help you with, because you are trying to teach the machine something. You want to build something that does what you want, so you kind of need examples where you know the answer, and then you can also evaluate hey, how does this model do out of the box for some easy tasks? Hey, you might find something like GPT-4 can give you 75% accuracy out of the box without without any work. So that's kind of good, or even higher. Sometimes it's if it's a bit harder, you'll see, okay, you get 20% accuracy, which is kind of which is pretty bad, and the bar is very low, but that's kind of the ballpark that you're also looking to beat. And then you can look at examples that are predicted by the model. All you have to do is look at them. Yes, correct. If not, you make a small correction, and then you go through that, and you basically do that until you've beat the baseline.
It's kind of the transfer learning aspect, right?
Yeah, and then you use transfer learning in order, to give the model the solid foundation of knowledge about the language and the world, and you can end up with a model that's much smaller than than what you started with, and you have a model that's really has a task network that's only trained to do one specific thing.
Which brings us from going from prototype to production, where you could sort of try some of these things out, but then maybe not run a giant model, but something smaller, right?
Yeah, you can take all these aspects basically that you're interested in a larger model and train components that do exactly that. And I think another thing that's also good or helpful here is to have kind of a good path from prototype to production. I think that's also where a lot of machine learning projects in general often fail, because it's all, you have this nice prototype and it all looks promising and you've hacked something together in your Jupyter notebook, and that's all looking nice. You maybe have like a nice Streamlit demo and you can show that, but then you're like, okay, how can we ship that? And then if your workflow that leads to the prototype is completely different from the workflow that leads to production, you might find that out exactly at that phase, and that's kind of where projects go to die, and that's sad. And so that's actually something we've been thinking about a lot, and also what we've kind of been trying to achieve with Spacey LLM, where you have this LLM component that you plug in, and it does exactly the same as the components would do at runtime, and it really just slots in, and then might use GPT-4 behind the scenes to create the exact same structured object. And then you can swap that out. Or maybe, there are a lot of things you might even want to swap out with rules or no AI at all. Like ChatGPT is good at recognizing US addresses, and it's great to build a prototype. But instead of asking it to extract US addresses, for example, you can ask it, give me Spacey rules, matcher rules for US addresses. And it can actually do that pretty well. And then you can bootstrap from there. So there is a lot of there's a lot of stuff like that you can do. And there might be cases where you find that, you can totally beat any model accuracy and have a much more deterministic approach if you just write a regex. Like, that's still true. It's just something, it's just something it's easy to forget, because, again, if you look at research and literature, nobody's talking about that, because this is not an interesting research question. Like, nobody cares. You can take any benchmark and say, I can beat ChatGPT accuracy with 2 regular expressions. And that's true. Probably in some cases. It's like, nobody cares. Like, that's not research.
Yeah, for sure. But what is nice to do is to go to ChatGPT or LM Studio or whatever and say, I need a Python-based regular expression to match this text, and I want a capture group for that. And I don't want to think about it. It's really complicated. Here you go. Oh, perfect. Now I'll run the regular
expression. Also explain what that's a good use case too. I've still been sort of hacking around on like these, interactive regex editors, because I'm not particularly good at regular expressions. Like on the scale. Like, I can do it, but like, I know people who really, I think my co-founder, Matt, he worked through it. Like, he's more the type who really approaches these things very methodically. And he was like, now he once read this one big book on regular expressions, and like, he really did it like the hardcore way, but like, that's why he's obviously much better at it than I am.
I consider regular expressions kind of write only. Like, you can write them and make them do stuff, but then reading them back is tricky. At least for me. At least for me. All right, let's wrap this up. So what are the things that you did here at the end of your presentation, which I want to kind of touch on, is you brought back some of the same ideas that we had for, like, what are the values of open source, or why open source, but back to creating these smaller focused models. Talk us through this.
Task-specific components. I mean, if you kind of look at, hey, what are the, the advantages of that sort of approach that we talked about, of distilling things down, of creating these smaller models, a lot of it comes down to it being like, it's modular. You're not locked in to anything. You own the model. Nobody can take that away from you. It's easier to write tests. You have the flexibility. You can extend it because, it's code. You can program with it, because often, very rarely you do machine learning for the sake of machine learning. It's always like, there is some other process. You populate a database, you do some other stuff with your stack. And so you want to program with it. It needs to be affordable. You want to understand it. You need to be able to say, why is it doing what it is? Like, what do I do to fix it? again runs in-house. It's entirely private. And then, when I was kind of thinking about this, I realized like, oh, actually, it like this really maps exactly the reasons why that we talked about earlier, why people choose open source or companies. And that's obviously not a coincidence. It's because ultimately these are principles that we have come up with over a long period of time of that's good software development. And ultimately AI is just another type of software development. So of course it makes sense that the same principles make sense and are beneficial. And that, just having a workflow where everything's a black box and third party, this can work for prototyping, but it's not, that kind of goes against a lot of the things that we've identified as very useful in applied settings.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we have to answer the question. Will it be monopolized? Or your contention is no, that open source wins even for LLMs.
Yeah. So I think open source means there's no monopoly to be gained in AI. And I think I've kind of broken it down into some of these strategies, which how do you get to a monopoly? And these are like, this is not just some vague stuff. These are things like a lot of companies are actively thinking about. If you're in a business where it's winner takes all, like you want to get rid of like all of that competition that companies hate, that investors hate, and there are ways to do that, and companies really actively think about
pesky competitors. Let's get rid of them.
And that's and so there are different ways to do that. Like one is having this compounding advantage. So that's stuff like network effects, like if you're a social network, of course that makes a lot of sense. Everyone's on it. If you could kind of have these network effects, that's good, and economies of scale. But as we've seen, like economies of scale is a pretty lame mode in that respect. Like that has a lot of limitations. It's not even fully true. It's kind of the opposite of a monopoly in some ways.
Especially in software.
Yeah, in software, exactly. So it's like I don't think that's not really the way to go.
Yeah. One example of that comes to mind, at least for me, maybe I'm seeing it wrong, but Amazon.com. Just, how many companies can have massive warehouse with everything by every single person's house?
Yeah, no, exactly. And then it's also, you have the one platform that everyone goes on. So even if you're a retailer, you kind of, Amazon has kind of forced everyone to either sell on Amazon or go bust because.
Exactly. It's very sad, but it's the way it is.
Yeah.
And then so network effects, I'm thinking, people might say Facebook or something, which is true, but I would say like Slack actually.
Okay. Yeah.
Or Slack or Discord or, there's a bunch of little chat apps and things, but if you want to have one and you want to have a little community, you want people to be able to, I already have Slack open. It's just an icon next to it versus install my own app, make sure you run it, be sure to check it. Like people are going to forget to run it and you disappear off the space,
Yeah, no, I think that will make sense. And I do think, a lot of these, like it's, these things don't necessarily happen accidentally. Like companies think about, okay, how do we, Amazon definitely thought about this. This didn't just like happen to Amazon. Yes, they were lucky in a lot of ways, but like, that's a strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's not relevant here is like, another way is controlling a resource. That's really more if you're like, if there are physical, if there was like, a physical resource.
Cables, something like that.
I mean, it's, or like in Germany, I think for a long time, the telecom, they owned the wires in the building.
Right. Exactly,
and they still do, I think. So they used to have the monopoly. Now they don't, but they kind of still, to some extent, they still do because they need to come, no matter who you sign up for internet, telecom needs to come and activate it. So if you sign up with telecom, you usually get service a lot faster.
A little better server, exactly.
Yeah, because
don't wait 2 weeks. Use us.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of that's how it still works. But we don't really have that here. And then the next point that's very attractive. The final one is regulation. So that's kind of like you have to have a monopoly because the government says so, and that is, and I think that is one where we have to be careful because if we're not like if in all of these discussions, we're not making the distinction between the models and the actual products that have very different characteristics and are very different things. If that gets muddied, which a lot of also companies quite actively do in that discourse, then we might end up in a situation where we sort of accidentally or give a company or some companies a monopoly via the regulation. Because if we let them write the regulation, for example, we're not just regulating products, but lumping that in with technology itself.
Yeah,
And
I saw
open
part of
research.
it's a part of your talk. And I can't remember if it was the person hosting it or you who brought this up, but an example of that might be uh, all the third-party cookie banners rather than
Yeah.
banning, just targeted retargeting and tracking. Like
Yeah.
instead of banning through the GDPR, instead of banning the thing that is the problem, it's like let's ban the implementation of the problem.
Yeah. And I think that's a risk, or that's
Yeah.
in hindsight, yes, I think in hindsight, we would all agree that we should have just banned targeted advertising. Instead, what we got is these cookie pop-ups. That's really annoying. Or that's actually what I feel like is one of the, as much as I think the EU, I'm not an expert on AI regulation or the EU AI Act, but what I'm seeing is at least they did make a distinction between use cases. And it's very much, there's a focus on here are the products and the things people are doing. How high risk is that, as opposed to how big is the model? And how, what does that, because that doesn't say anything, but that would kind of be a very, very dangerous way to go about it. But the risk is, of course, if we're rushing regulation, then, we might actually end up with something that's not quite fit for purpose. Or if we let big tech companies write the regulation or lobby with
to get it,
some ideas, because if they're doing that, I think it's pretty obvious they're not just worried about the safety of AI and are appealing to Congress or whatever. I think most people are aware of that, but yes, I think the intentions are even less pure than that, and I think that's a big risk.
Yeah, it really is. The regulation is very tricky. It's
just for the record, I am pro-regulation. I'm very pro-regulation in general, but I also think you can, if you fuck up regulation, that can also be very damaging, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be put in a way so that it makes it hard for competitors to get into the system.
Yeah.
Right. There's so much paperwork and so much monitoring. You need a team of 10 people just to operate. Well, if you a startup, you can't do that because, hey, Art, we got 1,000 people and 10 of them work on this.
Yeah, and I think it's also even beyond that. It's if you think back to all the stuff we talked about, they are this goes against a lot of the best practices of software. This goes against a lot of what we've identified that actually makes good, secure, reliable, modular, whatever software, safe software internally, and even doing a lot of the software development internally. There are so many benefits of that, and I think companies actually working on their own product is good. And a lot of if it was suddenly true that only certain companies could even provide AI models, I didn't even know what that would mean for open source or for academic research. That would make absolutely no sense. I also don't think that's really enforceable, but it would mean that this would limit everyone in what they could be doing. I think and there's it has nothing to do with there's a lot of other things you can do if you care about AI safety, but that's really not it. And also, I just think being aware of that is good. I don't I cannot see an outcome where we really do that. It would really not make sense. I could not see the reality of this shaking out, but I think it's still relevant.
Yeah, I think the open source stuff and some of the smaller models really does give us a lot of hope. So that's awesome.
I hope I felt I feel very also very positive about this. I've also talked to a lot of developers at conferences who said actually well, you know, thinking and talking about this gave them some hope, which obviously is nice, because I definitely, that's some of the vibe I got. Like, people, it can be kind of easy to end up a bit disillusioned by like a lot of the narratives people hear, and that, you know, also, even if you're entering the field, you're like, wait, a lot of this doesn't really make sense. Like, why is it like like this? And it's like, no, it actually, you know, your intuition is right. Like, you know, a lot of software engineering best practices, of course, still matter. And you know, no, they are, like, you know, they are better ways, and we're not just
Nice.
going in that direction. And I think,
Yeah.
I definitely believe in that.
A lot of the reasons why open source won in a whole bunch of areas.
Yep.
Could be exactly why it wins at LLMs as well, right?
Yep. And, you know, again, it's all based on open research. A lot of stuff is already published, and there's no secret source. The software industry does not run on like secrets. All the differentiators are product stuff. And yes, you know, OpenAI might monopolize or dominate AI-powered chat assistants, or maybe Google will do. Like, that's, you know, that's a whole race that, you know, if you're not in that business, you don't have to be a part of. But that does not mean that anyone's going to win at or monopolize AI. Those are very different things.
Absolutely. All right, a good place to leave it as well.
Yeah.
Ines, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks.
You know,
that was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, people want to learn more about the stuff that you're doing. Maybe check out the video of your talks or whatever. What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think I'll definitely give you some links for the show notes like this. The slides are online, so you can have a look at that. There is at least one recording of the talk online now from the really cool PyCon Lithuania. It was my first time in Lithuania this year.
Mhm.
So definitely, you know, if you have a chance to visit their conference, it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about Lithuania as well. Then we also, on our website, Explosion AI, we publish kind of this feed of like all kinds of stuff that's happening, from, you know, maybe some talk or podcast interview, community stuff. There's still like a lot of super interesting plugins that are developed by people in community, papers that are published. So we really try to give a nice overview of everything that's happening in our ecosystem. And then, of course, you could try out Spacey LLM. You know, if you want to try out some of these generative models, especially for prototyping or production, whatever you want to do for structured data. Yeah, that's
awesome.
And then yeah, also if you're at any of the conferences, like, I can check out the list of events and stuff. I'm going to do a lot of travel this year, so I would love to catch up with more developers in person, and
Awesome.
you know, also learn more about all the places I'm visiting. So
that's cool. I've seen the list. It's very very comprehensive. So
yeah, also, I'm kind of a neat freak. I also very much like to organize things in that way. So
nice.
Yeah.
So there might be something local for people listening that you're going to be doing. All right. Well, as always, thank you for being on the show. It's great to chat with you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Till next time.